When we consider an artist and his work, we often consider the art object and its morality more so than the artist themselves. But we also have to consider the involvement of the artist and their relation toward, or directly toward, such art object. In Berleant's framework, he focuses his efforts towards describing the integrity and the morality of the artist towards the artwork itself, rather than the society, but more so his artistic vision and his responsibility to project or to produce a work uh, that embodies his artistic vision to a T. And so I have this like really fun slide on the trolley problem, especially with regards to ethics, of course. It's one of the most recognizable, but we are asked in this case that should we persecute an artist that perpetuates ideas that are against the status quo, against the society, or should we kill the society that censors? And most importantly, I also add that such a society is not necessarily an evil society from today's standards, or at least from with respect or with relativity to our morals. And so this is what Berleant says on such topic, that the path to an enlightened society is far beyond censorship and restriction, and rather it promotes free thinkers of all kinds. When we relate such a view to what we've described earlier, is that we don't kill the artist whatsoever, neither do we kill the society. Instead, we pursue a sort of equilibrium state of both sides existing, regardless of their dialectics being conflicting or contradictory. So there is significant cause for the concerns over the social effects of art, and for good reason. This is what Berleant says, that for all that is distinctive about the world of art, there is little doubt that a web of threads binds it to the rest of the social fabric. In other words, they are all interconnected in a way that the artist is directly responsible for his art, but also grounded in the society he inhabits. So this is what Berleant talks about in his work called Art and Morality Towards an Ethics of Art. So we first consider a background. Uh, this is what Berleant initially introduces to us, is that the history of how we used to tackle the concept of art ethics. Is that whether the act of art is moral has been a significant philosophical question for centuries. This is what we observe from Plato. And although art ethics was not the primary focus of that, he was also famously a hater in his work The Republic. It's made clear to us from his interpretation of metaphysics, or his framework, particularly of metaphysics, where art is described as second degree imitations of the real, which the ideal referent of all particulars proceed from, and hence they are sort of degradations of the form of the beauty that Plato paints. And actually, this is not necessarily the case. What Plato really despises is the fact that a poet or an artist can make anything attractive, and hence can create false ideas that appear to be the reality that people could accept. And then, following from this is a student, Aristotle, that suggests that a statesman could intentionally use the pleasurable effects of music, poetry, and painting to mold citizen character. Of course, this is in line with his deep foundations of ethics being rooted in character formation, virtue ethics, and Nicomachean ethics, and so on. And then we proceed to scholasticism. So, in the scholastic world, the Middle Ages largely suppressed pure aesthetics, as well as, of course, the initial metaphysical interpretations were adapted to be used for theology. In other words, philosophy and theology was uh, largely sort of bounded together, intertwined, and all other things that would not be beneficial toward theology or proving the existence of God would be sort of discarded. And that is to say, an intrinsic purpose of art was categorically restricted as a valid means of art creation. So I put an image of Hypatia of Alexandria in the painting school of Athens, or in the fresco by Raphael. This is because we pertain to the Enlightenment period here. That in the radical Enlightenment of the Renaissance and the modern day, it, we sort of get to a point where we start to relate the artist and the moral status of the artwork itself. And so when we interrogate a piece, we also interrogate the artist. Um, Directly quoting, for them, the painter must be a kind of priest, and piety and virtue were regularly thought of as part of the necessary equipment of the would-be painter, and hence that would also be by extension to the artist, and also, of course, in relation to when we evaluate the art object. In early modernity, Joshua Reynolds identifies a right moral purpose as a core maxim for an artist. Hence, it's also a, I guess, like a necessary condition towards, or not, yeah, a necessary condition towards proving the moral okayness of an artist, per se. And so, in page 2 of his work, Berleant says that the moral demands are placed on the contemporary artist of a scope, intricacy, and difficulty not found before. This is what he claims because in the modern day, of course, as we notice that a lot of our morals are elevated to a point where dialectics becomes more apparent compared to before, where um, what was perceived to be an ideal or conflicting ideology would be suppressed by whatever the status quo presents. But now, since we are in an era of free speech and democracy, this becomes like elevated to a much larger extent, that the moral demands that we place upon the artist and their work becomes much harder to evaluate. So this is a painting of the Vienna State Opera in 1912. Beautiful painting, but this is an art object, of course. So when we evaluate the moral status of an art object, what does it portray? That's what our fundamental question would be. And these are the two axes that most of art ethics revolved on, and actually our primary focus was on the moral status of the art object. But then we consider the artist. This painting was actually created by Adolf Hitler, and of course it's not necessarily an evaluation of Adolf Hitler as a person, but it just highlights or elevates our or rather accentuates our discussion of how we tackle art ethics. Do we focus on the art object alone, or do we also focus on the moral stature of the artist? What special privileges does the artist have toward their work that is sort of exclusive to them? So this is what Berleant uh, focuses on, right? So when we focus on the moral status of the art object, an object challenged for formative influence and is subject to censorship. So it's one of the things that Berleant really emphasizes on is censorship. Of course, to the norms of society. If we recall the trolley problem, the suppression of the artist is sort of akin to killing the artist themselves. This is a Morsola painting, and the reason why I look at this is because the normativities of art become sort of instrumental in forming the beliefs of the general population. So when you portray a general population in a certain way, they typically follow or fall toward that status quo, especially when it's romanticized to such a degree in the likes of Amor Solo. And this is also very akin to if you if you consider the reading by Renato Constantino of the Miseducation of the Filipino. the portrayal of the Filipino as a sort of agriculture-based country, but eventually turned it into the general consensus that they would remain in such a manner that industrialization would not be as much of a popular option. I mean, when we consider the moral stature of the artist, this centers on the artist who produces the artwork, and is rather pursued or tempted, perhaps exploited by a social order. And this is, uh, yeah, this is where we focus our efforts towards, as I said earlier by Berleant, is that it's less studied, but it's directly related to the art object. So when you sort of draw the line, there's a direct connection, direct responsibility of the artist towards their art object. So the fundamental question we answer here is, do the moral constraints that prevail as part of the social code apply equally to an artist, or is it so distinctive that it requires the artist to occupy a privileged space, uniquely immune to the rules that guide other actors in the social drama? And Berleant divides this question into three parts. In other words, the fundamental question that we talked about later is that, is the artist in a position to be invulnerable to the ethical rules that subjugate other people? Of course, other people are subject to such social codes and rules. If we further reduce such to the normativities that apply to any human agents, not apply the same to the artist. It's just a more technical description. And if such were the case, do you think that we as a society would be morally justified in censoring what the artist produces, the art object, even as little as one element? Well, that's exactly what we answer through these fundamental questions, or division of questions. And the division of questions isn't necessarily a division of the question itself. It's more of the division of the status of the person being interrogated. For example, you have the general demands, or the artist as a person, this distinctive social demands, or the artist as a social participant, social actor, as a professional who occupies a certain social role, perhaps, and as a unique demands of the artist as an artist alone. So these are the things that are exclusive to the artist. So by predicate logic, you have like three big circles that you study here. A human agent or a social actor such that normative social code is applied. So this is basically applicable to all human agents that are participating in the universe. So it's a universal rule that applies to everyone as a moral being. But when you consider a person as a social actor, it's more of the person not necessarily being a professional, but as a person within a certain society. Of course, not all normative, uh, or moreover, not all social rules are applicable to every universal human being, uh, precisely because there are multiple societies, and of course, not every person necessarily is part of a society, and such a particular social code is applied. So the way that Berleant tackles this is when we consider a sort of a doctor and its responsibility towards the patient, it's also the same responsibility of the artist to treat their muse in a certain way. And of course, our inner circle is the artist inhabiting their own space within that social actor circle. Likewise, other professions will have this, but since we're focusing on the artists themselves, we're only focusing on the particular role as an artist, and the social code of the artist alone exclusively is applied. So, as per the general demands to Berleant, the artist as a person has no special privileges on their own, of course. They follow the same rules, same set of universal rules, same normative rules, and are not unique to the profession of the artist. As such, he lists ostensibly the standard social codes of honesty, trustworthiness, ambition, and ego. Moving on, we have the distinctive social demands uh, of the artist as a social participant, as a member of society, as a professional. We invalidate the claim of the absolute artist laissez faire, which falsely assumes the artistry automatically benefits public welfare. So basically, we do not automatically assume that just because you're an artist, you inhabit a certain space, that all that you do, all that you produce, will necessarily be a social good. So artists could not immediately be assumed to be entirely non-harmful, and thus we can't allow them to have a special privilege, likewise of any other social profession. So the highlight here is that he is not very different from a doctor, he's not very different from a teacher, he's also not very different from a lawyer, and so on and so forth. This is because he also inhabits a certain space in the uh, social code or the social environment that um, they still have to follow certain legislation, and certain rules, and hence they do not occupy any different demands of them. Right? There's nothing special being demanded from here, when relative to any other social participant. Unlike the pre-established demand of the general demand of the universal demand that is demanded of every person, regardless of, again, whether they inhabit a certain space in the social space, social sphere. The products of an artist consist almost entirely of the fuse, of course, indeterminate social effects that shape public awareness and modes of action, and hence, of course, composites of artworks may constitute a false reality. This is what Folkyard discusses, and there's also a really nice article written on him about Impressionism, how uh, it's a sort of hyper-real, it's divorced from realism, of course, and so on and so forth. And I also liken it to the concept of theological state apparatuses by Althusser. So this is a rather Marxist application of the discussion. This is a painting of Hermann Otto Hoyer. In the beginning was the word, a sort of romanticization of the Nazi Party. Of course, when we consider Nazi art, the Nazi Party was very much romanticized by the artists and the filmmakers and the propagandists and so on and so forth. And hence, we can see the normativities being created here that proceed from the artist and are thus a direct relation to the art object. So if an artist enters the employ of commercial industries or they align with totalitarian regimes, if they use their art to relinquish, if they use their art and they relinquish absolute autonomy and assume responsibility, of course, this is what we discussed later, but when an artist creates something that's beneficial towards a totalitarian regime, but is not necessarily aligned with their own artistic vision, it's a sort of disgrace towards their artistic morality. But if you consider that the social participant of an artist, um, does this in terms of being controlled by the society or by Hitler or so on and so forth, then of course that's a disgrace. But if they really believe this and they really align with totalitarian regimes, then it's not actually. So now we move on to what is exclusive to the artist, right? So the artist, as an artist, has exclusive moral demands upon them, and that is in two ways manifested, right? And that is in revealing reality and their artistic morality. Now, in revealing reality, we sort of reject Plato here. When we reject Plato's metaphysics of art being a degradation of the truth, we sort of see how art sort of elevates and manifests the essence of realism here. D.H. Lawrence notes that it's a delicate balance between the artist and the universe, since the artist has a sort of manner of describing reality in such a way that it intensifies another person's perception of reality. And again, of course, it's such a way that lets artists argue that art serves as an intensely serious role in bringing truth into being. Hence, the manifestation of the art style of realism. And this is also in art ethics or in art morality in the next slide, but an artist becomes immoral when they put their fund in the scale. This is precisely what I was talking about earlier when you are affected by external falsified goals. you will tend to, or you will disgrace your own artistic morality. So what happens when the unique demands of the artist clash with standard social code? For example, um, an artist wishes to create a work that would harm a specific population or minority, but it goes um, in hand with their vision, right? So when we evaluate artist morality or individually, like exclusively to the artist, you would not be doing a disgrace to your own art morality because your responsibility is toward the art object itself and your artistic vision. However, when you consider like a societal standard, when you, of course, when you hurt somebody directly, in a manner that would directly kill them, then of course it goes against the universal codes. And such, this exclusivity is not necessarily an inner circle more so, but more of a special space that is unhindered, right? So the artist has to produce that thing even if it hurts a specific population. But of course, it also goes against the universal status quo. But they still have to produce that thing because it's within their artistic vision. So it's not necessarily the case that it hurts somebody. So when we consider like let's say an example later on I will show in the application part, but Berleant says that the principle of aesthetic priority dictates that the creative integrity of the artist's work must take the precedence over the immediate comfort of the community. In other words, whatever the social code is should not dictate whatever the artist produces, and hence they should inhabit their space of their own where they're able to produce anything, absolutely anything, as long as it goes along with their artistic vision. Now, a lot of people could argue against it, saying, of course, um, the individual perception of a person is contingent towards the society they inhabit, and hence something like this would definitely be questionable. But of course, there are social codes that we can consider, and when somebody rebels or an artist rebels, then they should prioritize that sort of rebellion in their work, and of course, they should rebel. Is what the principle of aesthetic priority claims. So unless it is the case that the artist has an innate vision towards serving a totalitarian regime's interests, then it is against their own artistic integrity and morality to abide by such external forces. So, for example, if you uh, are supportive of a fascist regime, of course, it's not going to be ideal for the universal, um, or that would also be a moral assumption. But when we assume such a thing, um, and a freedom fighter would go up to you and fight against your vision and would try to suppress your vision and so on and so forth, then when you let yourself when you let yourself succumb or be subject to those external forces, then you are going against your own artistic morality. But then again, since your artistic morality or your artistic responsibility is also contingent towards what your morality entails, there exists a sort of shaky um, uh, counter position towards what Berleant says here. So when we target the morality of creativity, I'd like to use the example of Hideo Kojima in his work. Hideo Kojima famously departed from Konami in 2015 as he clashed with the corporate interests of the company Konami. Um, Hideo Kojima was famous for his work in MGS and most recently within Konami. His latest work was Silent Hill PT. But then the corporate interests started to conflict with his own artistic vision, and so he eventually broke off from Konami and he made his own studio, own engine, or I don't really recall, but I think he either made his own engine or brought the engine to his new studio. And this is a perfect example of breaking away from external interests, in this case, corporate interests of Konami, and intervention. And this is why I also claim him to be an exemplar of artistic morality. that Berleant proposes, right? And in other words, even if Dante was completely petty and including his enemies in his depiction of hell, in the Divina Commedia or the Divine Comedy, specifically in Inferno, right? If it was in his creative vision, then he must include it to complete his work in an absolute integrity and responsibility towards his own artistic vision and toward the art object itself. It's not necessarily the art object itself, actually. It's more of his responsibility to intrinsically art as art in itself, right? And so this is a really funny meme that I saw. I don't really know who made this, but it's on Pinterest. So thank you to whoever made this meme. And I also relate this to Lopez, uh, Lopez's argumentation of the rejection of the ivory tower notion of art for art's sake. And this is also what I would claim earlier, is that, of course, the artist is contingent to the moral standards. Um, some people would, and since all of this is contingent, he maintains that while writers must not produce true art through propaganda, they cannot ignore the vital, political, and human realities of their time. And this is sort of beneficial towards our perception of art rebellion, but uh, it is also remain remaining to be the responsibility. In literature and society, Lopez tries to say that art for art's sake is not necessarily the case. You cannot make art for art's sake. It's always art contingent to reality or contingent to the social status of the environment that the artist inhabits. And of course, such a claim is also uh, not necessarily contradictory, but contradicts some claims of Berleon. Like, for example, you don't have an innate responsibility to art itself because you are responsible for your art and the society, and hence you don't occupy a certain position in reality that could contradict it, right? So an individual can possess a detestable personal character while maintaining flawless integrity and truthfulness to artistic vision. So the example is usually Wagner and Mozart, and of course Mozart. If you assume Mozart and Wagner to be binary opposites, the good and the bad, they both were artistically moral people, regardless of whether they committed atrocities or were just happy, giddy people, right? And such a commitment to integrity turns the artist into the harshest critics of themselves. Our example for that is Franz Kafka. He famously is used by Berleon as the extreme of the perception of being one's greatest critic, as he felt unfulfilled in his work. His deathbed request was for Max Brod to burn his unpublished work, particularly his novels, but eventually they were published. And well, of course, this um, he had this integrity and full commitment to the part. But of course, Max Brod would interfere. But his own responsibility was fulfilled, right? Regardless of whether his work was burned. So how do we reconcile the social morality and the artistic morality? Aren't they contradictory? You have a rebel artist and typical social norms, or you have also rebel artists but really good social norms in more, and hence may also be the other way around, right? Of course, you have the example of Jose Rizal here. The norms of the Spain occupied, Spain colonialized Philippines was far from ideal, extremely horrible conditions for Filipino people, subject to the Spanish friars at the time. He was a rebel artist in that regard, and hence is going against towards that social code, uh, just to be in line with his social condition, social or not social necessarily. His artistic vision is, in a way, an example also of artistic morality. But when we apply Lopez, right, it's not exclusively his artistic vision. In hindsight, it's actually there's no such thing as artistic vision alone, because in Lopez's ideas, it's also contingent towards the social norms, right? So it's not going to be something isolated. It's more something directly linked, but opposing, right? So there's this Berleant proposes this sort of twofold standard for jurisdiction towards such a thing. Uh, it was established to resolve where society can step in and must stand back from interfering or from censoring the artwork. An enlightened society cannot rely on overt censorship just because it disagrees with certain views. It's inherently crude to say such a thing, of course, because is it really an enlightened society if you're suppressing a certain view, right? And so the final resolution to this is that it must require both spheres to exist in a state of mutual and healthy tension. Truth and ideals can and must coexist, such as the lesson of Pokemon Black and White. And then so only when we understand such a dynamic do we see how we can tackle a system that once promoted that the idea of the manifest destiny was a force of benevolence. It was not. And so when we create artworks like Manifest Destiny by Sakai, we challenge the status quo and we have to use art to rebel when the system is broken.